Okay, so today I have Hunter Coates with me. Um, he is a rising, brilliant theologian, you know. Introduce yourself, Hunter, please.
Yeah, I graduate from my undergrad degree this December. I will then go on and begin in the fall New Testament studies master's. I've applied to several schools. I'm still waiting to hear from several. I've already heard back from two. I have those if I need to, but I'm looking for some of the big name schools. But yeah, so waiting to hear back from those. And if all goes well, I will be starting New Testament scholarship in fall and continuing to write from there.
Great, wonderful, wonderful. So, uh, I wanted to basically chat about universalism, the free will defenses, annihilationism, and since like you are like going to do like some scholarship, I want to ask you some questions about like recent scholarship related to
Hmm.
uh, soteriology, right, in Christianity. Um, yeah, so this will be fun. Again, this, by the way, this is not my field. I care more about normative ethics, metaethics, metaphysics, political philosophy, right? So, theology, that is not like very connected with New Testament scholarship, right? So,
Hmm.
you are the one who's doing uh, scholarship stuff, New Testament studies or like
Yeah,
biblical studies and stuff like
yeah,
that. So I will ask questions related to that, for some people who are like, who really want a kind of like scriptural basis for
yeah.
like universal salvation, universalism. So I will ask you questions about that. Um, I guess to start, um, I want to ask you, like, what was your journey like, right? Like, how did you arrive at universalism? Were you always a universalist or something?
Yeah. For me, universalism was sort of just like sort of the obvious option. Like when I sort of mentally made the change to Christianity like 2 years ago, and it was sort of like I found universalism, and it seemed to me sort of just to be like, yeah, like that would make the most sense. Just off prima facie, on the face of it, that idea would make the most sense. So I was just like, yeah, I mean, I guess I'm a universalist. That time I wasn't really looking into everything, right? It took me a good 6 months to like kind of transform to be like, how can I justify this and whatever. But yeah, I mean, by that point it was pretty set in stone. There was no way I was going to be Christian and not a universalist. It didn't. Those are two yeah, contradictory statements, and if when I was becoming Christian, I saw those as contradictory. So
Hmm. Hmm. Do you think, so historically, I think Aquinas, Augustine, and I think these philosophers considered omnibenevolence much different, like in a much different way than I think around the time from the time of like C.S. Lewis to current time, right? Like
mhm.
omnibenevolence was considered very different, right? I think Aquinas believed like Aquinas believed in like literal torture, like actual brutal torture. Say I think Augustine too. Thomas Talbot has like a Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy
Mhm.
article on like more older views of eternal hell.
Yeah,
Those views were like it will be torture, it will be worse than torture, and God will actively punish you.
yeah, yeah. I
Right.
mean, I can talk a bit about that. I mean, when you look at the New Testament, you certainly get this idea in certain verses that there will be this like this tormentorous afterlife, right? I would point to like stuff in Revelation, the idea of the lake of fire, right? Um, Maybe even the idea of the biting and gnashing of teeth that is this common phrase that we see at the end of some of Jesus's parables in the Matthean and Lucan materials, and Mark, I think, a little bit too. That's sort of one of the big phrases people hear, the biting and gnashing of teeth, and then the lake of fire. So these are kind of hellish concepts that like the everyday Christian will know and hear of, right? And then, there's some other stuff in later writings, later Christianity, third century, second century, you get this idea of like individual punishments being done to people. So the text like Apocalypse of Peter talks about like these individual punishments that are being done to people. Um, Depending on what you did, that's the punishment that you get. Like one of them is like adulterous women, they get their breast tortured. Like that's one of the punishments
Mm.
in the Apocalypse of Peter. And for men who are like liars, they get their tongues cut off, right? And so that's this sort of hellish depiction, which is sort of growing in like this sadistic nature of it. Like the sadistic degree is increasing as the second century and third century of Christianity passes on, right? But even within this milieu of this growing idea that hell is this like torturous afterlife, you do have people that don't think it is, right? I mean, you have people like Origen of Alexandria, right? You have people like Saint Gregory of Nyssa in the fourth century, right? You have people like Saint Gregory the Wonder Worker, and today is his saint day, who was Origen's disciple. And he was also a really big influence on Saint Jerome the Great. And Saint Jerome the Great was a universalist for largely a lot of his life. So you have these figures, and I can name 20 others. I do that in the introduction of my book, right?
Mm.
But I'm just trying to cut time. So there are these people that are pushing against this narrative that hell is this, torturous eternal. But the dominant idea is that hell is this torturous eternal. And it's not the idea that we cause that pain on ourselves. A lot of modern believers in hell, from the 1800s onwards, will say like, what hell is the soul's sense of corruption and hatred towards God and fellow neighbor being reflected back on itself, and the person experiences that wrath and hate that they had towards others in life in hell and well in the afterlife, and that's what constitutes hell. It's that reflection back of the wrath and hate. So that's a very modernist way to understand hell. It's not traditional at all. So if your response to universalism is that it's not traditional, one, yes, it is. I can point to figures, saints, and otherwise where it is traditional. I can also point to scriptures as well. Two, you're not the one who's being traditional. The universalist position that I hold is actually one found in the early church, literally exactly word for word. The position you hold is not found in the early church and is not found until being charitable the 15th century, but more likely the 19th century, right? So the argument against universalists is that it's not a traditional view. You kind of shoot yourself in the foot twice. But yeah, so when it comes to this more modern idea of hell, it's that hell is this torturous existence, but we will it on ourselves.
Mm.
So that's the one you see in C.S. Lewis, and you see that in a lot of later justifications of hell in writers that are writing today in Catholicism, Orthodoxy, and Protestantism. So it's this very milk toast understanding of hell. And you see it also, switching gears a bit, you also see it in Muslims writing today. When you read the Quran, you don't see the idea that the believer or that the person causes the hellfire to themselves, right? You don't see that in the Quran. What you see are these very descriptive punishments,
Yeah.
resembling early Christian apocrypha that I mentioned, right? You can draw like literary relationships between the two, but that's a different question. Clearly the idea is that there are these individual punishments for people in the Quran that are in the fire, that are in hell. But Muslims today will do the same thing as Christians today. They will say that no, actually, that's the person's hate that they had towards God, right? That becomes reflected back on them, and they experience that. But
Mm.
again, same thing with the Christians. That's just totally anti-traditional. It's totally a modernist bias. It's totally an interpolation of text. It's never there. So that's just, my starting point on the difference between the old view of hell and the modern view of hell.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. Great. So the thing is like, like I have no problem with like torture to like for like extremely horrible people, I guess,
Mhm.
like Hitler, Stalin. But even that torture, like torture is always brutal, right? It's always like even a second of being burned on your finger feels extremely painful,
Hmm.
right? So I think if there is torture, right, in hell, personally, I believe probably will be, but I think those would be reserved for like even the worst of the worst,
Yeah.
and I think that torture will not last more than, I think it should not last more than like the individual who suffered on earth the most.
Yeah.
You know, it should
Yeah.
not last more than that, right?
Yeah.
I think that's my view. Um, so the thing is that the issue is like eternal torture.
Yeah.
That's like that lasts forever. That's the
Yeah,
issue.
that's the thing Universalists don't like is the eternal part
Yeah.
of it. Yeah,
Yeah.
Universalists don't deny that there will be some sort of punishment. What they
Yeah.
deny is that that punishment is quite literally never ending, right?
Yeah.
Um, and there are many ways that one can justify this, right? I mean, there's just a simple question that I think that a lot of Muslims and Christians in the scholastic period would ask is they would say, what is the hellfire for? What is the purpose, right? There's this constant idea in the scholastic philosophy, and I'm talking about this because I was reading about this today, so it's right on my mind. That there must be a purpose for everything, right, in creation. And just intuitively, a Christian would agree with that. If I said, you're a Christian, there must be a purpose for everything in creation, they'd go, well, yeah, right. God makes things with purposes. Okay. So why does hell exist? Right. So that's when the Universalists and Muslim Universalists were doing this, but Christian Universalists were too. They were saying that, well, the purpose for the hellfire is that it brings people to repentance of God, right? People to repent to God for their sins. So that's just a basic question you can ask yourself. Why does hell exist? What is the purpose?
Yeah.
Now, the person that believes that hell is eternal, they have to concoct all these crazy reasons why hell would exist at that point,
Yeah.
right? Now, one of those could be, well, it's because I call this the status argument in my book when I deal with it. It's the idea that because humans are finite creatures and God is an infinite creature, and thus humans have finite value and God has infinite value, that
Yeah.
if a finite that if a being with finite value offends a being with infinite value, then the punishment on the being with finite value must correspond to the value of the entity offended. That means that since the value of the entity offended is infinite, the punishment must be infinite. Thus, eternal hell is justified. Right. So that's kind of an argument people give in the literature sometimes known
Yeah,
as the status argument.
so just to like
Yeah.
Oliver Crisp does this, right? Oliver Crisp believes like I think at this point, like I think I heard from Thomas J. Ord that he's like very universalistic leaning, like he hopes universalism is true, like Oliver Crisp, right?
Hmm.
So he in his I think 2003 paper, he talked about status principle, which is that
Yeah.
and the analogy he gives for status principle is like this, right? If you punch a dandelion, if you hurt a dandelion, you don't get any punishment. It's just a dandelion. If you hurt a dog, that's serious, relatively more serious than dandelion. If you hurt a human being, that's more serious.
Hmm.
Right? And
Yeah.
similarly, since God has like infinite value, so if you offend God or hurt God, then like you deserve like that crime is of like infinite seriousness.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
deserve infinite suffering, basically. That's
Yeah,
the
that's the argument. Yeah,
status
I mean,
principle.
I consider it just purely absurd. I mean,
Yeah.
I give two reasons for it. I mean, just one of them is just like, suppose a 4-year-old girl steals candy from a candy store, right? She knows what she's doing, right? She's four, she's not a baby. She's purposefully going in the candy store. She's leaving her parents and she's going to steal candy. Okay, so that crime of stealing, right, is a sin. A sin is a act against God that separates you from God. Okay, that's an inf that sin thus is an infinite act of guilt that the girl must bear. Now, let's say that there's a serial killer and he kills 5 people, okay? So the serial killer and the girl both have done infinite amounts of sin because the girl did one sin, but that's still an infinite amount of sin. And the serial killer killed 5 people, well, it's still an infinite amount of sin. He could have killed one person, right? So there's this idea that sin, if sin is infinite, if every sin is of infinite value, then the little girl who stole candy from a candy store is just as guilty in the eyes of God as the serial killer who killed 5 people, right? So that's obviously absurd. So then the person must say, well, there must be different variances of infinitude for sins. But then you get into very weird territory. This is extremely arbitrary, right? I mean, I could draw out all these different hypotheticals,
Yeah.
but it would just it would just you would have to boil it down to the idea that this is the way it is because I say it is. There is no set standard you can give me, right? That's not purely arbitrary and that I could expose. So I think that's a stupid argument.
Yeah.
The other one would just be the idea of original sin. I mean, I would just appeal here to just the idea that if you think that everyone that has sinned against God is counted with the most infinite guilt, then the baby that is not born but dies in the mother's womb, that baby has infinite guilt because it's born with original sin, right? People that believe this usually believe original sin is this doctrine of total depravity. So. And if you believe the doctrine of total depravity is true, that literally all people have like this repulsion to the good, and that the desire for the good can only be imputed into them by God, right? Not of their own choice, but God does this on his own, and that is the only way that we can desire the good, that we can desire to be better people. Then an infinite that dies in the mother's womb doesn't have that imputed righteousness, right? So that infinite will necessarily be subject to, following this argument, eternal damnation. But I just say that's retarded, and you know, and I mean the literal sense. I think that when I use that word, I mean it in the medical sense that it was used. It's that you have a cognitive disability to think that that is a justified position, that an infinite that an infant that dies in the mother's womb should be subject to eternal punishment. I'm using that word not in a polemic way. I'm using it in the genuine way. Like you have some sort of cognitive disability, maybe a psychopathology as well, right? I've done work on psychoanalysis. You probably are dealing with some sort of deeply seated neuroticism of some sort, and maybe some sort of obsessive compulsive. But I don't want to psychopathologize my opponents too much, but there's something seriously wrong with you if you think that a infant that dies in the mother's womb will be subject to eternal punishment. And I don't need to hear your arguments. I don't care what saints you cite. I doesn't matter to me. So
Yeah. Yeah, agreed, right? So to just talk about that first thing that you said, right? Like as you said, right? Like
mhm.
they do this where they talk about there are different variations of infinity.
Yeah,
But the issue is like this, right? So suppose a little girl stole like that candy, right? 4-year-old girl, and that girl goes to hell. Now, if hell is literally like so for 1 million years, she's like enjoying everything, and then just one day she kind of gets like a little bit of an itch.
yeah,
I mean, so after every 1 million years, she
hmm
gets a very small itch
yeah,
that goes away in like a few seconds after she itches.
hmm
Every million years.
yeah.
So first 1 million, second 1 million, third 1 million, it goes on forever. And if you want to say that that is eternal hell, right? If you want to say that is eternal punishment, I think universalists could be sure. I mean, I guess sure,
Yeah, I
sure.
mean,
It's like,
I tend to not speculate on the time of the duration of hell and a person's duration in the hellish state. I mean, Second Peter talks about how like a day on earth could be like 1,000 days for God, right? So it seems that a 1,000 days on earth could be a day for God. So it seems that like time on earth, time in our finite world, functions differently than time in the afterlife, right? So I don't tend to speculate on the duration of hell and what kind of punishment a 4-year-old girl would get that dies after stealing from a candy store. But I would just have to trust that God is the end of rationality and he's the truth and he's the love and he's the good. And so there's no way that she would, get anything that she does not deserve, right? So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And another thing with the status is like, I think I watched your status principle video. That was fantastic, right?
Mm,
I think you talked about like, it's also about knowledge, right? If
yeah.
you're a finite being, you cannot even comprehend what it's like to offend an infinite being, right?
Yeah.
Like if a dog, I mean, it's like if a rabbit punches you, it's like,
Yeah.
you're not harmed. Obviously,
Hmm.
you're not harmed. You don't care about it. It's a rabbit. Like it's
Yeah.
nothing to you, right? So it's like harm absolutely matters. And another important thing is like like the status principle people seem to believe like the value, like think of this, right? So, okay, if someone says, okay, punching a dandelion is less serious than punching a dog, and
Hmm.
punching a dog is less serious than punching a human being, if you imagine, like, suppose there are aliens who are like 50% better, have
Hmm.
higher intrinsic value, and then 60% higher intrinsic value, 70%, but there's always seemed to be a point where this value, even if it's infinite, the punishment that the person would get
Hmm.
seems to be still bounded, right?
Yes.
In the sense that it's like, if you punch me, suppose versus punching a dandelion,
Hmm.
sure, that is bad. But like, it also depends how strong the punch was, right? How much consequences the punch had, right? And it's like, it depends on that, right? So even if you are retributivist, who
Hmm.
believe in retributive justice as something that is objective, that needs to be done, right? You need to take all of this into account, the knowledge, right? And whether or not, even if the value is unbounded, the
Hmm.
status of the person is unbounded, the punishment could be bounded, right? Because it's just like totally implausible that if you stole like something from God's property, let's just suppose God lives in a mansion,
Hmm.
you stole like a grass speck,
Yeah.
and then you deserve eternal torture for that.
Yeah.
That's just implausible. That is just straight up nonsense. And
Yeah.
if you are a deontologist,
Hmm.
you believe already that, like, if you are a moderate deontologist, most people in the history of the Christianity, pretty much any like view, they were moderate
Yeah.
deontologists, like
Definitely.
virtue ethicists. So that means virtue ethicists already believe this, right? So okay, you can harm someone somewhat to save like a million lives,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
So they believe that, but you cannot harm someone for to do a little bit of greater good, right?
Hmm.
But you can harm for enormous amount of greater good,
Yeah.
right? So they already believe that there is some level of boundation up to which it's allowed, right? But when the consequences go disastrous, right, then those rules are overridden.
Hmm.
Especially if you are a deontologist, if you already believe that sometimes consequences of certain things can override these sorts of rules,
Yeah.
then you must believe that when the consequences are so horrifying that the well-being of individuals is so significantly reduced, it goes like negative infinity, the well-being goes negative infinity, then you must believe that this rule of status principle can be overridden,
Hmm.
considering the horror that we are seeing, especially if you're a moderate deontologist. Now, of course, if you're a consequentialist, but then you have to model whether retribution is intrinsically valuable. Because if it is intrinsically valuable, then you are literally saying that God should create situations
Yeah.
where retribution needs to happen.
And people in Christianity did make that argument. John Duns Scotus, the 13th century or 12th century scholastic philosopher, he made that argument. He made the argument that hell would have to exist and that God would have to create people to be in hell. Like that was an argument he made, right? So people do make that argument, which is silly, right? That intrinsically retribution is a good thing and that it's done for the sake of itself. It's not done for the sake of anything else.
Yeah.
So there are people that make that argument, but I think that most people that are non-universalist in Christianity would still not make that argument that hell must exist. It's not like a necessity, right? So, yeah, I mean that's
Yeah, and to support your further points against the status principle, I would
hmm
also say is like when you like I since I like am into like normative ethics, so I read papers and stuff like that on it. And one of the fantastic philosophers, Richard Yeater Chapel, talks about like, look, if you're thinking about ethics, we should also think about like what fundamentally matters, right? That is also an ethical question,
hmm
right? What matters, right? So when you think about this, right, and you think about some of the values, like love is a value, right? It's a positive thing. You talk about human beings have intrinsic value. You
Yep.
talk about all the sentient beings have intrinsic value. They
hmm
matter, right? You talk about happiness of these of all sentient beings is intrinsically valuable. God's happiness is intrinsically valuable, right? When you think about all these values and when there's a conflict, you have to think which value is more important, more
hmm
fundamental, right?
Yeah.
Like when you answer the question, why did God even create, right? You think about, okay, what fundamentally matters, which value is more important,
hmm
right? So, in pretty much all cases, pretty much all philosophers, I think, would say that retribution is not as valuable to lead to like eternal torture, right? I think whether like secular, I guess, I mean, the older Christian philosophers, as you said, like John Duns Scotus, like believed in like retribution to have that much value, such
hmm
that God does that horrific thing, but that's just implausible. Like that just does not make any sense. Like you have to motivate why retribution is that intrinsically
Yes.
valuable, right? Because you have to put retribution above the well-being of that being,
hmm
not just well-being, love, right?
Yep.
Because
Yep.
and if we are thinking about love as a union, right, as a
Yep.
friendship, so you believe, like Duns Scotus would have to believe that retribution is more important than friendship. It's more important than the well-being of the individual who's suffering,
hmm
right? And I think that's just not plausible. And in fact, retribution itself is in question in recent like normative ethical debates, right? Like it's actually very hard to justify retributive justice. Like
hmm
it's actually very hard, like most of the time. Like Alan Wood is like a Stanford philosopher, academic philosopher. He wrote Kantian Ethics. It is considered the best defense of Kantian ethics. He released that book in 2007, so that's
hmm
21st century work. It's fantastic work. And he literally says that Kantian justification for retribution fails.
Wow.
He says that it fails. He tries his best and he says that he feels sad that that justification fails
Yeah.
because
Yeah, that's fair.
because he feels that deterrence and all those theories of punishment can be over punishing, right? At least
Yeah.
retribution allows you to kind of constrain the punishments, but deterrence can lead to like disproportionate punishment on an individual. So he's worried about that. So and he also like talks about like Hegelian view of retributive justice. I think Hegel tried to justify retributive justice by saying that the person, like, it is good for the person.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So
Who-
what Hegel says is he takes Hume's idea. Sorry, not Hume. Hobbes. Hobbes has this idea that with retributive justice, it's because the punishment of the state is internalized by the person, and therefore the person is doing the judgment on themselves. It's actually the same thing that we see in the C.S. Lewis argument. I've actually never connected these two before, but I just did that now. It's really fascinating. Now, got me thinking. But same thing we see actually. It's that what Hegel says is that because the person is under the state and is in a sense the state, if you understand Hegel's idea of spirit and the philosophy of that, The idea is that the punishment that the state does to the person is the same is understood to be the internalized punishment of the person themselves,
Mm.
right? The person is a punishment. The person is doing the punishment on themselves because they are the criminal of the state, which is the state is themselves. So it's a I don't want to get into Hegel's,
Yeah, yeah,
philosophy of statecraft and
of course.
ontology. It's a lot. That's a different
Yeah,
conversation
yeah,
altogether. I've
yeah,
done
yeah.
that before.
Of course.
But yeah, I mean, that's just there is a sense of an internalized punishment which can be compared to C.S. Lewis and stuff like that. So
Yeah, yeah. But ultimately, Alan Wood says that Hegelian justification for
yeah,
retributive justice fails.
yeah,
Kantian justification also fails. And recently, it has been like very hard to justify retributive justice, right? And if you're a classical utilitarian, basically any welfarist utilitarian is just gone. Any kind of welfarist
yeah,
view, if you have any kind of welfarist view, then retribution is pretty much gone, right? If you are
hmm
a welfarist consequentialist, if you're a welfarist deontologist, right, retribution seems just gone. So status principle fails on multiple levels. It fails internally, it fails externally, right? Um,
yeah,
so there is now there is this view that is, I think, in recent days, in modern times, it's famous, which is it's annihilation, but that annihilation is like something that people themselves seem to choose, right? Like
yeah,
in
yeah,
that movie, Good Place. Sorry, it's a TV show.
yeah,
In the TV show, in the Good Place ending, the the human beings, like in the ending, say that I'm paraphrasing that death is important for happiness. Death gives life meaning. And so annihilation as not a retribution, right? But annihilation as a person's choice. Um, so now, of course, I find that to be implausible. I will give my reasons, but I want to ask your thoughts. What do you think about that kind of annihilationist view where the people themselves just say to God that they want to die and that's it?
yeah. So there's kind of two types of annihilationism. I call this non-penal annihilationism in my book. And then
Yeah,
there's penal annihilationism. So non-penal annihilationism is the idea that the soul is not intrinsically immortal, but that God grants immortality to certain souls, and other souls that do not have that granted immortality simply cease to exist after a certain period.
yeah,
So the idea is that um, you know, the souls, everyone will, either go to hell or heaven at first, right? But eventually, hell will cease to exist in the sense that all those souls that have been in that separation between heaven and hell, they will simply cease to exist with the cease to existence of hell. Now, there is a really, really big philosophical, uh, let's say, benefit of this view. And I make this point in my book against infernalism, against the idea of eternal damnation, is that for annihilationists, they truly, truly can say that everybody that exists at a certain point will exist in the pure love and happiness of God, right? There will be nobody that will be tormented forever, right? So the idea is that they can get over a lot of difficult scriptural hurdles that I think that infernalists cannot, such as 1 Corinthians 15:28, that God will be all in all, pantas and passen, where God is understood to be literally all in all, meaning that all people will view God as their all, as all that they desire, as all that they want to exist by, right? So annihilationists can engage with that because they go, yes, God will be all in all, because all the souls that exist at a certain point, say the eschaton, right? God will be all in those souls. But the souls that don't exist, God won't be all in them, but that doesn't matter, right? Because God's still all in all. So that gets a big scriptural and philosophical hurdle over infernalism. But I would go back to 1 Corinthians 15:28 and say that the issue with the all in all response for the annihilationist is that God isn't ever truly all in all. God is only all in all and all the existing people that exist at that point. So let's say
yeah,
that
Exactly.
Here, I'll use some philosophical language here. Let's say that at point T1, there's the totality of heaven and hell, and there's people in heaven and hell. Okay, people are being, eternally tortured. People are not eternally. People are being tortured. People are being in blissful existence. Okay, now let's say at T2 there are no people being eternally tortured, being tortured. Only
Yeah.
people in blissful existence, right? So therefore, the idea is that only people at that given point T2 will God be all in all in them? That is to say that God is not all in all people. He's only all in all in those that exist at T2. So that's a
Yeah.
problem for the view, right? Because the view doesn't really say that God will be all in all to all people. It just says God will be all in all to that specific group of people that exist at T2. So
Hmm.
I make this a big point in chapter 16 when I'm engaging with the philosophy of annihilationism is that I don't think that it can adequately account for this very radical verse, right? Because God, when when those people cease to exist, right, they will still be with God, right? God has foreknowledge, God has all the knowledge in the world. So those people that cease to exist, their knowledge of who they were and the connections that they made in their lives will still be with God. Moreover, the connections that they made in their lives and the memories that they established with people in their lives will be with those that are saved. So not only can annihilationism not say that God is all in all, but annihilationism kind of shoots itself in the foot twice here, because it says that while those connections exist and those people that loved them still continue to exist in T2, let's say,
Hmm.
those those connections are only those connections only exist as like distant memories of suffering, right? Because
Yeah.
now those people no longer exist. There's no longer those connections to build with them. They now those people that had those connections with them just see those connections as suffering, right? Because it's the lost memory of a loved one.
Yeah.
So this creates two massive problems for annihilationism. Those are just two. I mean, I have more. I lay out four or five. I mean, you can maybe do the fifth one, but
Yeah.
I lay out like
So,
four or five. I think annihilationism, while I agree with David Bentley Hart, that annihilationism fits better with scripture overall than the idea of eternal damnation. Just
yeah.
looking at the prima facie text of scripture, like when you see words like abomination and destruction, Apolloumai, Apolloumia is destruction. When you see words like Apolloumia and you see words like let's cast out into the outer darkness, ekbalo, right? Cast out. These types of things, like they really give you this sense that people are simply ceasing to exist. And
Yeah.
there are secular scholars like Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman thinks that Jesus taught annihilationism and he thinks that Paul taught annihilationism, right? So Ehrman doesn't do this from like a theological point of view. He doesn't care what Paul or Jesus taught, right? He says this as a secular scholar. So I think that it's a really big problem for people who are not universalists to engage with annihilationism because it proves to be a much more defensible position from scripture, not tradition. There's no annihilationist saints, there's no annihilationist liturgical text, So if you care, if you care about tradition as I do, it's very hard to defend, but if you look at scripture alone, annihilationism definitely accords better with the majority of scripture compared to an idea like eternal damnation. So,
Yeah. And like the issue, I think annihilationism, that non-penal annihilationism
yeah,
also seems to assume that happiness runs out, right?
yep,
At least for human beings, happiness runs out. But, I always think like, okay, look, think of music or
hmm
your favorite band. You listen to your favorite band like repetitively sometimes, right?
yeah,
Like you listen to it like Monday, then perhaps you listen to it again on Friday,
hmm
then next Friday or next Saturday, and you enjoy. You enjoy.
yeah,
It's not like you literally use something and just throw it forever.
hmm
That doesn't work like that, right? Um, Romantic relationships, right? Erotic stuff, like people love
hmm
it, right? They seem to love it every day, right? So if someone is married, right? They have a partner, loving partner, right? They seem to enjoy sex with them like every time, right?
Hmm.
Um, then they're like TV shows. Sometimes people watch them again, right? Then there are like video games. People seem to play older video games again, enjoy them, right, with
Yeah, I
their
recently did
friends,
that. Yeah.
right? People
Hmm.
play video game like FIFA, football, soccer,
Yeah.
right? People enjoy them again and again, right? I love FIFA
Hmm.
video game, like enjoyed it a lot, like with my friends. It's just very enjoyable, People like there's so many things that people enjoy, so many adventures, right? Like mountain hiking and stuff like that. I mean, there's so much stuff, and people enjoy that repetitively, right? So
Hmm.
if you believe, here's the thing, if you believe that 80 years is great, so if you believe that all these all these things are not running out in 80 years, right? All these enjoyments are not running out. Why think that they will run out in 160 years, in 200,000 years, in 1 million years? Why do you think that
Yeah.
these things would become boring, right? Why do you think that pleasure runs out? So it's like in that good place that
Well, I think I have to respond here is that annihilationists aren't saying that the happiness of heaven is going to run out. The Good Place maybe say I haven't watched that show.
yeah, okay, okay. Yeah, I
I
mean,
hear it's
I
quite
think
silly and philosophically naive. But I want to be clear for annihilationist viewers. Let's not strawman them.
yeah,
We don't think that you're saying that heaven will become boring. Like this is not like a Schopenhauerian, thing where Schopenhauer is like heaven will be boring and everyone will hate it, right? Annihilationists don't believe that. What they believe is that people that have rejected God will simply cease to exist because they have not been given immortality in their soul. That's the position of annihilationism, of non-penal annihilationism.
yeah, okay, okay.
I think we should just kind of put that aside because I don't really know what yeah I annihilationists don't think that heaven will run out of happiness. That's not something. So
Yeah, yeah. Okay, gotcha. I mean, it's more like in modern culture. I'm talking about like non-penal annihilationism seems to be like something that people are okay with, right?
yeah.
And I was responding to that. I'm like not responding to the more mainstream traditionalist like act like Christian non-penal view, right? Like it's called like conditionalism basically, right? I think the
Well, this is
non-penal.
my point is that conditionalism
Yeah.
posits this is I'm explaining what conditionalism is.
Yeah,
Conditionalism is the idea that people that do not have an intrinsically immortal soul. That
yeah,
their
yeah.
soul is only made immortal when they choose to follow Christ and they begin living their life as Christ, right? That's what makes them immortal.
Yes. Okay.
Before that, they're not immortal. And if they stop doing that, or if they don't do that, they will not be immortal and their soul will cease to exist. So the idea of annihilationism, non-penal annihilation, has nothing to do with happiness or any of that. It's all about the choice of choosing to follow Christ, and if you do not, you are not made immortal, right? There's really great text to read on this. Paul Griffiths has a 2007 article where he talks about non-penal annihilationism. He tries to justify it. I think his justification fails. I engage with it, but there are really great articles to read.
Yeah.
James Spiegel has a 2019 book on is it 2017 or 2019 called Hell and Divine Goodness, where he justifies non-penal annihilationism. It's one of the main texts that I engage with in the annihilationist sections of my book. I also think he fails quite miserably at some points.
Chris,
I just want to be clear that we're
yeah.
not I don't know what this happiness thing is. This isn't annihilationism. I just want to be
Yeah,
clear.
yeah, yeah. I get it. I understand.
Yeah.
Um, Chris Date, I think you heard of him, right?
Yeah, I've
He's
heard of
an
Christie, yeah.
annihilationist. Do you engage with Chris Date in your book?
No, I really stick with Spiegel and I stick with Edward Fudge, because Spiegel is a philosophical, like he's a philosophical academic, so he's justifying philosophically, and Fudge is the more scriptural defense, and so I engage with those two, and then at certain points I engage with there's one other person I engage with. I can't think of his name. He's a Catholic annihilationist, but anyways, those are
Hmm.
the two main ones. Yeah.
Gotcha. Fantastic. So, um, one of the things about um, okay, one of the things about annihilationism
Hmm.
is that so when you think of Like animals, right?
Yeah.
According to annihilationists, what's their fate?
I actually don't know. Edward Fudge doesn't talk about that, nor does James Spiegel. I haven't read a paper on animals and annihilationism, but what I would imagine, hmm, I actually don't know if I would say what I would imagine because I could be wrong and I wouldn't want to like, say something out of turn. I'm not sure. I would just have to say I don't know what an annihilationist would think about animals. I don't know if there's a
Yeah.
paper on that. That's actually
So,
interesting though.
so to me, their annihilationism has basically two horns, at least
Hmm.
with respect to animal suffering.
Hmm.
If animals go to heaven, they live forever. Then you have a bonobo who who has just chilled out in his whole life, right?
Hmm.
Is in heaven chilling out, but then human being got killed by God. Um, Human being does not have immortal soul, a
Yeah,
bonobo does. Um,
it's funny.
the other horn is like if these animals just die, they don't
Yeah.
have immortality, then that means that they suffered brutally in on Earth, right? Some of the animals just starve, some of the animals are
Hmm.
eaten alive, they just die. There is perhaps so dealing with animal suffering, the problem of animal suffering, the problem of evil becomes harder. There's another, I guess, middle ground view you could take, which is that okay, God keeps the like so the animal who suffers, God gives them immortal soul for like 100 years or 200 years, and then like kills the animal. But then it's just becomes a bit strange. It's like,
It's just like arbitrary. It's like why? Like
yeah, why?
what's the cutoff point? Yeah, that's
Yeah,
actually really
like
fascinating. I've never thought about the relationship between animal suffering and annihilationism. Um, I don't know. I haven't read anything on that. Have you read like a paper on that, or is this just like your own idea?
that's my. I mean,
Yeah.
with respect to animal suffering, Dustin Crummett has like animal heaven view,
Well,
right?
yeah, but does he talk about annihilationism?
Yeah, no, no. I mean,
You should write a paper on this. This is really
since it's like
fascinating. I've never heard this.
I
This
mean,
is
since
really
it's like
good.
normative ethics,
Yeah, yeah.
the problems with respect to animals just dying
Hmm.
or like eternal hell. I think like ultimately like from his paper, I think you can create an argument for universal salvation
For animals, yeah. No,
based
it's
on animal
fascinating.
suffering.
C.S. Lewis believed that animals would be saved, at least pets. He talked about how pets, because it wasn't like a vegan argument at all. It was actually a very anthropocentric argument. The
Yeah, yeah,
argument for
yeah,
C.S. Lewis was that your pet is like your property, right? And so you imbue yourself into your pet. And so being separated from your pet would be like being separated from part of yourself, right? So if you are saved, your pet will be saved with you is the idea. But he
yeah.
doesn't engage with those pets that aren't saved. So that's interesting, right?
And basically all
Yeah.
the animals, right? Like who are suffering in the wild and just
Yeah.
dying brutally, right?
Yeah.
Like,
He only talks about pets, so it's a very anthropocentric
yeah, very
framing
unfortunate.
of the argument, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, I guess at this point it's just implausible to me. Like, I think universalism should become a dogma in the future, in the upcoming centuries. In
I mean, I'm
the
not gonna say it should be a dogma. I don't have any ecclesial position to say that, but I would just say that I think that more people, both laymen and both laymen and priests and bishops are starting to be more interested in universalism, and so I expect that this trajectory will continue, um, especially with the use of the internet and people being able to engage with all these different ideas that maybe in the 15th century, if you're living in Russia and your local church doesn't have a universalist priest, which it wouldn't, you would never know about universalism, right? So
Yeah,
with the internet, whether you're in Russia, whether you're in America, you can get these ideas of universalism. And I think that priests, especially in the Orthodox Church, where priests are expected to be academically intelligent, you can't just be in Greek Orthodox and Antiochian Orthodox and maybe some other um, patriarchs and some other patriarchates. you have to have at least a master's degree in theology and then another related discipline, right? So you have to understand this stuff. And so people that are academically inclined and are interested and are intelligent can go on the internet and read about the stuff and make their own decisions. And I think that priests are starting to do that. Lay people are starting to do that. And so I think that's going to be the change. It's going to be a change through the internet. It's going to be a change through technology. And it's going to be a change through people rethinking the things they were told were teachings of the church and starting to see the teachings of the church in a new light with help from the saints and the great wisdom that a lot of early saints have poured out concerning universalism. So
Gotcha,
yeah,
gotcha. How
yeah.
much time do you have left?
We can do another like 10 minutes.
Okay, 10 more minutes, right? So, okay. Do you know Mark Murphy? Mark
Yes.
Murphy.
Mark Murphy's one of my endorsers for my book. He's a really good guy.
I'm glad because
Yeah.
Mark Murphy has like he does not seem to believe in the way like his view of omnibenevolence is very different, I guess. Like he's
Are you
like
talking about Mark Murphy, who wrote a book on Lacanian psychoanalysis and John the Cross?
I'm talking about Mark C. Murphy who like
Oh,
William.
different person. I'm talking about Mark G. Murphy.
Oh, you are
Never
talking
mind.
about Mark D. Murphy.
G. Murphy.
Oh, G. Murphy. I'm talking about this Mark Murphy. Let me share my screen. I guess I think you can quickly see if
Yeah.
you know the guy or not. Let me just share my screen. Um, okay, I'm sharing my screen now. Okay, so this Mark Murphy,
No,
Georgetown,
different guy.
Mark C. Murphy. Like this person wrote this book, God's Own Ethics.
Okay, cool.
This person, right? So, is any of the books you know?
I haven't read any of those now.
Okay, so this Mark Murphy is like an academic philosopher. He's pretty famous, you know.
Yeah,
Uh,
he's at Ithaca. Oh, no, that was a reviewer. Never mind.
yeah, no, sorry. Mark C. Murphy is different. This is the book. The reviewer is different. This
Yeah,
is
yeah,
Craig Duncan.
yeah.
Mark C. Murphy is in like a Georgetown
Oh, in
University.
Georgetown. Okay, I got you.
Yeah, I think his yeah. So he has worked with like William Lane Craig on stuff.
Hmm.
Um, and one of the things that he does, right? So Mark C. Murphy uh, um, believes in like this holiness, right? That holiness is the more fundamental property of God rather than love, right?
Hmm.
He seems to base his theology on that.
I
Uh,
mean, for him, I would recommend. I think that the Quran would be a better text for him to associate himself with in the New Testament, because that the New Testament is all about love, and the Quran's pretty big about God's sovereignty. So maybe Islam would introduce him, but this doesn't sound very Christian to me. I'm not. I'm kind of confused here, right? This sounds
yeah,
more
so
Quranic than biblical, but it's how
like
these
the
that's how these people are, right?
Yeah, so like the Mark C. Murphy, like this is the thing that he does, right? He just seemed to like I think Laura Ekstrom I think refuted basically his view, right?
Mm,
Even Craig Duncan in this fantastic wonderful review I
hmm.
think says like his book is like unconvincing. It is very dense book, but it is like unconvincing, right? Ultimately. And even in his review, I think even in his review, I think he pretty much refutes Mark Murphy by just like presenting really plausible arguments. So to quickly show, I think one of the really good objections that Craig has that like Mark Murphy seemed to create this strange distinction between like God being indifferent to evil versus God like um actively engaging in evil, I guess. Like and he says like God
Uh,
can be like he I think he bites the bullet that God can be totally indifferent to evil.
yeah,
Right.
I mean, I reject that prima facie. I don't really care what he says after hearing that. It's just, I don't
Yeah.
know. This stuff isn't really interesting to me just because there's so many presuppositions that are latent in this guy's understanding that I completely reject. and any of these presuppositions, rejecting them would just make his argument fall flat. And so this is why I don't engage with this type of philosophy. I stick with people that have similar presuppositions as me, because if you're talking with someone with diametrically opposite presuppositions, you're never going to get anywhere with them, and any conversation is fruitless. So I just, I don't read this stuff. It's not for me.
Yeah, yeah. So I think here it says, right?
Yeah.
So I'm unconvinced by Murphy's argument that as regards divine sovereignty, an asymmetry exists between a requiring reason never to intend the absence of due well-being perfection and a requiring reason to promote due well-being or perfection. So
Hmm.
basically, God can create a being, right? And suppose that being um is having some level of well-being, but then after a certain point, God is like totally indifferent to
Yeah.
his uh, his well-being, basically. So it's like if a being suffers brutally, like God creates a situation in which a being suffers brutally and then keeps suffering forever. God will be totally indifferent to that. But God shall not intend actively for that being to suffer. Now, this distinction, even to this person, this distinction is, well, a bit strange,
Yeah.
right? Um, but like I think at least his objection is that, so Murphy believes that well-being promotion is like constraining God enough that his God sovereignty is like violated.
Hmm.
But but um the respect respect for the well-being for other people is not a constraint.
Hmm.
And this person says like, okay, this is strange, right? Like, why is promotion a constraint, but respecting is not a constraint? And this is a very good objection. But my objection is a bit different to Murphy. Like my view is that this distinction to say like promote and respect is
Hmm.
this seems very strange distinction, right?
Yeah.
Like when you love someone, it's not just that you respect, you also like care, like if they are sad or not, like you do promote their well-being, right? So I mean, so fantastic refutation of Mark Murphy. I mean, um, I recommend reading this if you care about this stuff. Like this is philosophy. Like Mark Murphy is like a respected philosopher, so I care about like what these respected philosophers are like doing
Yeah, I
in.
mean, I get why you care. It's just that this stuff has so many presuppositions that are wholly alien to me and wholly alien to orthodoxy and wholly alien to the East and the theology that I accept. And so
Yeah,
it just doesn't really for me this is like when it's like if I were to engage a Catholic on universalism and they start trying to refute me by quoting like statements from Pope Pius. I don't care what Pope Pius says, right? I'm not Catholic. Maybe it's just something I like. I'll quote him, but it's not like I'm beholden to Pope Pius, right?
yeah, yeah,
So when he's talking about all this nonsensical, weird ideas of God that reject monism, that reject divine simplicity, all this stuff. For me, it's just I whatever. It doesn't matter to me. So
yeah. Makes sense. Makes sense. I mean, I try to engage with these people is because I mean, of course, I think these people's arguments and like their views are just bad, but I
yeah,
at least respect them in the sense that they bite their bullets, right? They sort of bite the
yeah.
bullet.
I guess. I mean, I guess I
Um,
respect. Yeah, I guess I respect them for.
they're honest. Like at least Mark C. Murphy
Yeah,
literally says that God is not omnibenevolent in the way that normal people
yeah.
mean
There you
omnibenevolent,
go.
right? He
Yeah,
literally says that
yeah.
like God is like holiness is more important than love,
Yeah.
right?
I mean, I guess biting the bullet on the resurrection of Christ is not being about love. I guess that's
Yeah,
yeah, honesty is something you can say about that, but maybe verbose stupidity is another one. But yeah,
right. All right,
yeah,
all right, all right.
yeah,
It was a fantastic
yeah. It was a good
conversation.
time. Yeah,
Yeah, it was a fantastic conversation with you, my friend Hunter. Stick around because I want to ask your feedback after I stop the
Yeah,
recording.
and real quick, I just want to tell people where to find me.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
can
of course, of
find
course.
me at my YouTube channel, Dissatisfied Philosophy. You can also find me with my recent book coming out that's being published with Resource Publications, which is an imprint of Whitfinstock. Whitfinstock, if you've read Universalist books, you know that they've published stuff like Evangelical Universalist. It's a big company. They've many different imprints, right? I'm just in one of them, and this company's published stuff like Andrew Horonich's book recently on Universalism. So
Yeah,
this is the best company that you can get published with if you're doing a Universalist book. So praise God, I have been. So look out for that. It's going to be coming out in the next month or two. And other than that, I post essays on my academia page, Hunter Coates. So you can follow me on academia, catch my essays on there. And yeah, that's it. Thank you.
great, great. Okay, I'm stopping the recording now.